that's more of an explanation of why I'm trying to puzzle through these things and trying to puzzle through them with you. So anyways, we talked about the song last week, and you know, I made a hypothesis to you. We'll go through this quickly. It's doggerel. It's not great poetry, but it's irrelevant. It was a very popular song. It's quite beautiful. In the movie, it's actually sung by like a heavenly choir. That's what it sounds like. So it's got this cathedral. You could imagine people singing it in a cathedral, essentially. And so that's not accidental. It's purposeful. You know, it partakes of that. What would you call it? It partakes of that aesthetic. That's it. So the filmmakers are implying that what is about to be shown to you has this divine element, essentially, and that's signified by the choir of voices that sings this song. And the song says, fundamentally, something like this, is that if you lift up your eyes above the temporal into the transcendent, and so that's what exists in the heavenly world, in the stars. If you pick an ultimate goal, if you pick the right ultimate goal, then, and anyone can do this, that's the other thing, it's democratic, it's anyone can do this, so that's the second proposition. It doesn't matter who you are, you can do this. And so I think that's a reflection of the idea of the divinity of the individual. It's like there's something about each individual that's valuable regardless of their idiosyncrasies, and so they have this potential that they can manifest. And how do you manifest it? Well, you pick the right goal. And what's the right goal? Well, it's high, it's elevated, it's above the mundane. Now what does that mean? Well, you don't really know. You don't really know. That's why it's signified by a star, and a star is something that glimmers in the night, right? So it's a source of light in the darkness. And so there's a metaphor there. Obviously there's a metaphor there, and the star is the star that's the star of Hollywood, you know, the person that you emulate. That's part of it, because an ideal it's going to be a human ideal of some sort that you're aiming at, and so the ideal human being is the star that you're aiming at. Maybe it's something like that, if that's what you're aiming at. You might say, well, what should you aim at in life? And one answer is, well, why don't you aim at being whatever you could be that would be the best? Now, you don't know what that is exactly, because how do you know? You know, but you could think, well, that would be really good if I could have it. And then you could say, well, can I think of anything better than that? And if the answer is no, then, well, why not go for that? You know, and you might say, well, it's too ambitious, it takes too much responsibility. It's like, yeah, those are definitely problems. And one of the things that I've figured out over the years is that if you offered the person the opportunity, you know, because people say, well, life doesn't really have any ultimate meaning. It's like, yeah, okay, fine, so fine. Let's say it has an ultimate meaning, but that in order to experience that ultimate meaning, you have to take on ultimate responsibility for what you do. Well, that's a heavy price to pay to have a meaningful life, you know. And you might say, well, there's no damn way I'm going to do that. I'll just go for the, you know, pointless, I'll go for the trivial, pointless perspective, which, you know, is kind of hard on me existentially, but it frees me up. I can do whatever the hell I want moment to moment. I don't have any ultimate responsibility. And so then you think, well, that's kind of a good deal. And then but that raises this weird specter of doubt, which is, well, when you hear people talk about the ultimate futility of life, is it because life is ultimately futile, or is it because they've decided that they would just as soon not adopt the responsibility, and they use that real decision, which is to not adopt the responsibility, they rationalize that by proposing that life is ultimately meaningless. And like, you know, I kind of buy that. I really do think that's what's going on. So, but maybe not. But it could be that if you want to have an ultimately meaningful life, that you have to adopt ultimate responsibility. Makes sense. What might that mean? Well, one thing it might mean is that, and I do think it means this, is that I think it was Alexander Pope, but I might be wrong about that, who said, nothing human is foreign to me. And that's a hell of a statement, right? Because if you think about all the things that human beings are capable of, and they're capable of some, like if you really want to know what people are capable of, you should read about Unit 731. but I would not recommend it, because if you read it you will never forget it and you will be sorry that you read it, but you'll know. Anyways, to say that nothing human is foreign to you, that's a hell of a thing to say, because that means that what other people have done you could do, and that also means you need to take responsibility for that. That's no joke, you know, it's a big deal to do that in even a trivial manner. Anyway, so the idea is that you can elevate, if you elevate your viewpoint to some transcendent ethic, you want what's ultimately good, you really want that, whatever that is, you don't know, but that's what you're aiming at. Says that, well then it says this strange thing that, well, what you want will all of a sudden come to you. Well, that's a proposition, and it's the proposition that's basically played out in the movie. It's a hypothesis. The hypothesis is the best way to orient yourself in life is to orient yourself towards the highest good that you're capable of imagining, and then aim at that, and then things will work out the best way they can for you. And I believe that's correct. My observation of life has led me to see that that seems to be correct. So for example, you don't get something you don't aim at. That just doesn't work out, and so lots of people aim at nothing and that's what they get. So if you aim at something you have a reasonable crack at getting it. You know, you tend to change what you're aiming at a bit along the way, because like, what do you know, you aim there, you're wrong, but you get a little closer and then you aim there and you're still wrong, you get a little closer and you aim there, and you know, as you move towards what you're aiming at, your characterization of what to aim at becomes more and more sophisticated. And so it doesn't really matter if you're wrong to begin with, as long as you're smart enough to learn on the way, and as long as you specify a goal. So specify a vague one. I want things to be the best they could be, and I'm willing to learn what best means as I go along. Okay, so fine. And then you get what you truly need, we'll say. Well, maybe not. No, if your heart is in your dream, what does that mean? Well, that to me reflects this idea of a kind of integrated viewpoint. One of the things Jung proposed was that as you integrate yourself psychologically, what happens is that your rationality integrates with your emotions. They stop being opposed forces. Like the Enlightenment idea is that rationality and desire are opposites and enemies in a sense, and the Jungian notion is, and the psychoanalytic notion I would say in general, and the humanist notion even perhaps, is that no, that's not right. What you want to do is you want to integrate your rationality with your emotions and your motivations. They're not separable, even technically. They have to work together, and that all has to be integrated with your body. Not only do you have to take your heart into account and notice what it is that you want and don't want, but you also have to embody that. You have to act that out in the world. So fine, so that's what that means. And if you do that, then, well, then your horizons open up. And I also believe that's true. You know, I've known people in my life who are insanely successful, like insanely successful, and those people are, like, they're pretty damn together, man. You know, like, they're tough, smart, strategic, generous. You know, they're always giving people opportunities, honest, like they've got it all. You know, and sometimes, now I'm not saying that everyone who's wildly successful is wildly successful because they've got themselves together, but, you know, because there are crooks, and, you know, there are people who gain status one way or another by nefarious means. But that's a lot more unstable than you might think. And I can't say exactly if you pursue that route, you're going to pay for it. Like, you'll have your money or whatever it is, but it's not going to do much good for you. So it does seem to me to be the people that have integrated themselves and that are pursuing a noble goal, a high goal, who actually are able to do remarkable things. And remarkable things can be done at every level. You know, it isn't like you have to change the world. Like, as a whole, it could be that you do something remarkable within your family. You know, and that can be tremendously admirable. You know, someone's got to take care of a family member if they're sick. You know, like there's heroic acts that you can undertake in the local environment, and maybe that will go unheralded, let's say, but that doesn't mean that it isn't remarkable. I mean, I've met people who are so damaged, you just can't imagine it, and yet, well, one person I met when I was in Montreal was this woman, and she was just ruined, man. she looked like a street person, and she was so shy, she couldn't even look at you. Like, she basically looked at the ground because it was like there was light emanating from everyone else, and she was way too timid and humble to even bear it. You know, and partly what I was doing was trying to get her to straighten up and not look so street person-ish, because it wasn't going very well for her in social interactions, you know. But it turned out that that isn't what she came to the behavior therapy unit for. And she had her aunt, I think she lived with her aunt who was like schizophrenic, and then her aunt's boyfriend was an alcoholic who like went on long harangues about the devil, and it's like, really, man. And she wasn't bright, this woman, she really wasn't. And you know, she didn't really have a job, and it was just like, it was just not good in every way. And then she also, you know, had this unbelievable humility, and but then, you know, it turned out what she wanted. I just couldn't bloody well believe this, that she had this dog, and she used to walk it around. She took care of the dog, and that, you know, that was a good thing. And she'd actually been an inpatient at the Douglas Hospital, which is where I was working. And there were inpatients in the Douglas Hospital, and this was back in the 80s, and those people were like, she was like Superwoman compared to the inpatients at the Douglas Hospital. Those people looked like they were from a Hieronymus Bosch painting, because they had deinstitutionalized everyone that could possibly be deinstitutionalized, and so the only people that were left were people who couldn't be deinstitutionalized, and so those would have been people who were in the psych wards for like 30 years, and all of the hospitals were connected by tunnels underground, and the patients used to hang out down there by the Coke machine and so forth. And one day I took my brother down there, he was visiting, and like, it was just like, he just turned white, you know, because it was just really, I don't know if you know Hieronymus Bosch, he's very an interesting painter to say the least, but that's what it was like. And so here was her idea. She'd come to the behavior therapy unit because she'd been in the inpatient ward for a while, and she met some of these like ruined people, and she tried to get the hospital. She thought, well, I'm walking my dog, you know, and well, maybe I could take one of these patients out for a walk, you know. And she'd been talking to the hospital administrators, trying to get her, allow her to go, you know, take out one of these patients and go for a walk with her dog. And basically she had come to the behavior therapy unit because that's what she wanted to do. It was like, man, that person, she just blew me away. Like, it's like, I just couldn't believe it. Like, she had nothing going for her, like nothing, and yet she wanted to, you know, help some people that were worse off. And like, there just weren't that many people that were worse off than her. Mind-boggling, mind-boggling. And I never forgot it, and it really blew me away. So, you know, there are opportunities for elevating your sights within your realm of capability wherever you happen to be, and that's interesting. It's strange that that's the case. She brings those who love, that's what that should say, the sweet fulfillment of their secret longing, like a bolt out of the blue. Fate, characterized here as feminine, and that's what happens in the movie. The movie's got a Christian underbelly, like, it's quite pronounced, but it's really a pagan movie in many ways. So, for example, there's no blue fairy and the reason I'm speaking of Christianity, of course, is because this movie was created in a culture where Christianity was still reasonably intact, and of course it was fully informed by that. But the underlying mythos is not precisely Christian, even though it's informed by Christian imagery. There is this old idea, I think it's a Gnostic idea, that the wisdom of God is feminine, something like that, and anima, which means soul, is feminine. And so there's an idea like that lurking here. And anyways, that's fate, and that's the blue fairy in this particular movie. You know, she comes down from the star, which is kind of makes her an avatar of God. That's the idea. And she's the transformative agent. She's really Mother Nature, you know, in her positive guise, and that's why she can animate. To animate something means to infuse it with soul. That's what it means. And she animates Pinocchio, right? She's the force that frees him from his strings, and so that's her. Fate, like a bolt out of the blue, fate steps in and sees you through. Well, what that means, it means something like this, is that, you know, if you orient yourself properly in the world, and we'll say that you do that by trying to attain the ultimate goal, whatever that happens to be, then it's as if the world is on your side, and things go well for you. And I also believe that's true, because certainly one of the things that's more or less self-evident is that, generally speaking, if you tell the truth, things go a lot better for you. And the reason for that is, well, you want to have reality opposed to you, Or do you want to have reality backing you up? It's like, it's a pretty straightforward question. If you're truthful to the degree that you can be truthful, then reality is on your side. That's a good thing, because there's a lot of it and there isn't much of you. Whereas if you take a deceitful approach to things, then, well, then you're challenging reality. It's like, good luck with that, man. It's like you're holding a plastic ruler in front of your face and bending it, you know, and at some point you're going to let go, and it's going to, all that force that you've stored up, and it's going to snap back and nail you, and that happens. Like, I have just never seen anyone in my clinical practice ever get away with anything. Nothing. And it's not surprising. It's like, if you're going to mess with the structure of reality, like, it's going to mess back, and it does. And it might not happen for years, and you might not even notice the connection. I mean, part of what you do in psychotherapy is actually make those connections. It's like, why did this horrible thing happen to me? Well, who knows? It's like, let's take it apart. Well, who knows how far back we have to go? It might even have things to do, not even with you, it might have things to do with the errors in your parents' relationship. Like, you just can't mess with the structure of reality. It stays warped until you straighten it out, and it's not good. So there's an injunction here, which is that, you know, if you follow this path, you pick a high goal and you put your heart in it, you know, you commit to it, believe in it. Believe means to love. Believe and be love. It's the same thing. It means to act out. And that's what the belief means. Like, we think belief means to accept a set of propositions as true. Well, that is one form of belief, but that's more like factual knowledge, right? Belief is more like you decide that you're going to act something out. You make a decision and then you act it out, and that's a reflection of your belief. You know, it's you're staking yourself on something. Do you know? Well, no, because you can't. You can't know. You're bounded by ignorance. You can make your best guess and move forward, and you can do that with commitment, but you have to believe in order to do that. I guess that's why it's a wish. Okay, so fine. Well, then we have Jiminy Cricket. That's southern US slang for Jesus Christ, by the way. And the initial overlap isn't a fluke. I mean, I'm sure the animators thought that was funny, and of course it is funny. And you know, in The Lion King, you know that baboon who's the shaman, basically? Well, to begin with, he was kind of just a comic relief character, like a fool, you know. But one of the things Jung mentioned about the fool is that the fool tends to turn into the savior. It's an archetypal reality. Bugs Bunny is sort of like that, you know, he's a trickster. And as the movie developed, the character of the fool baboon took on the full-fledged, you know, shaman priest element. And you know, okay, well, Jiminy Cricket, he's this little cricket, and he turns out to be the conscience, which is pretty damn weird. It's like a bug is your conscience, and a bug is JC, and it's like, that's a very strange juxtaposition of ideas. Conscience, insect, savior. It's like, what's up with that? And so, well, what bugs you? That's part of it. Well, your conscience certainly bugs you, and you should pay attention to it. It's just a little niggling, annoying thing that you can't quite, you can override it, right? Obviously. But it's this, well, and he says, when he talks to Pinocchio later, he says it's that still small voice, you know. And I've asked people before, like in my personality class, like, because conscience is a weird thing. And like, if I said to you, if you're about to do something that you know you shouldn't do you have a voice in your head that tells you that you shouldn't do it? So how many people have had that experience? Okay, good. Now, so other people have a feeling instead of a voice. And so is there anybody here who's willing to admit it, who has neither the feeling nor the voice? Okay, so, and you know, it's a very understudied phenomena in psychology, this conscience. I mean, people can be conscientious, and maybe those are people who listen to their conscience more. I don't know, but nobody's ever investigated it. And the fact that you do have this little voice, whatever it is, inside your head, it's like, well, what the hell's up with that? You know, and it doesn't tell you what you want to hear, at least as far as I can tell. Now, you could say, well, that's the internal representation of society operating within you. That'd be a Freudian view. That's the superego. And certainly, there's something to that. But I don't think it's necessary to presume that that's all there is to it, and even if it is, you still wouldn't have the voice if you didn't have the biological potential to have that voice embed itself in you. So even if it is socioculturally constructed, which it is in part, it's like language. It's like your language is socioculturally constructed, but the reason you can speak is because human beings can speak. And if you have a conscience, it's because human beings have a conscience. And the contents of that conscience might differ, but the fact that it exists, what seems to me to be a universal. Okay, so, well, that's the conscience. And that's Jiminy Cricket. And then the cricket opens this book, and then you look at the book, and you think, well, what kind of book is that? Well, it's got a spotlight on it, so it's being highlighted. This is an important book. And what kind of book is it? Well, it's leather bound. It has a lock on it, you know. It's not some cheap book. It's kind of like you might think about it, looks like something from an old library, or maybe it looks biblical, whatever. It's a major league book, and this bug is the introduction to the book. So does that mean your conscience is the introduction to the book? Well, maybe that is what it means. It's certainly what's being played out in the movie. Well, then the cricket opens the book, and so then what do you see? Well, what does that look like? What does it look like? What does it remind you of? Okay, so that's the Van Gogh painting. It's a nativity scene. It's the Christmas star. And you know that because what's going to happen? Well, the hero is going to be born. That's what happens, and so a star signifies that. Well, why does a star signify the birth of an infant, let's say? Well, because there's something miraculous about the birth of an infant. And why would the infant be a savior, which is the Christian notion, say? Well, because that's what the infant is, potentially. Every infant. And so that's how you should act about them. And you know, one of the things that really is interesting about having little kids, and I loved having little kids, is that you have this opportunity to have this pristine relationship with someone, like a relationship you've never had with anyone, because the kid really is just there to love you. You're like, if you don't screw it up, you've got that. And then you can keep that going, you know, and you can try to keep that relationship like pristine, and that's so fun. It's so fun to try to do that. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing. And you know, kids get a bad rap in our society, but it's an amazing thing to have little kids, and they are remarkable, and they give you back far more than they require from you, and partly because they treat you like you're valuable beyond belief. That's what the kid thinks about you. It's like, that's pretty good. So yeah, it's like something divine is going to happen. And so okay, fine, you know, fair enough. Well, there's the star signifying that, and that's associated in some way with this star that you're supposed to wish upon. Well, that's kind of odd. Like there's this relationship that's implicit. The star that signifies the birth of the hero is the same star that you wish upon. Well, perhaps the star that you're wishing upon is the wish that the hero will be born in your soul. It's something like that. You're aiming at an ideal, right? It's the ideal you, whatever that would be. Well, you can certainly figure out what it isn't. That's where you start, as far as I can tell. You know what you shouldn't be doing, and you could at least stop doing those things and then see what happens, you know. And if you ask yourself, it's a meditative exercise, you know. And you do this with the autobiography to some degree. It's like, okay, sit down for 10 minutes and have a little dialogue with yourself like you actually wanted to know the answer, you know. So you ask, well, I'm probably doing something stupid that if I quit doing, my life would be better, that I could quit doing, that I would quit doing. And maybe it's not a very big thing because you're not very disciplined, but maybe there's something. Ask yourself that question, man. You'll have an answer in no time flat. Like, well, I should stop doing this. It's like, yeah, I know, and I could, and you know, I won't, but, or maybe I would, but if I did, I know my life would be better. It's like, you can figure that out immediately. And if you do that 100 times, well, you'll be in way better shape. So if you don't know what to do that's good, you could at least figure out what you shouldn't do that's just moronically, you know, pathetic, and you can be sure you're doing like a dozen of those things at least. You know, procrastinating, or, you know, everyone, that's what the conscience tells you, and if you ask it, it'll just tell you why you're, you know, stupid and insufficient. And so, who wants to hear that? But maybe you could do something about it. Okay, so the cricket comes into the village there, and he sees this like little house, and there's a little fire in it, and so it's kind of got a welcoming place. It's a light in the darkness, this house, just like the star. And so he hops towards it, and then he ends up inside it, and you know, there's a nice fire, and you get to see the inside, and the inside's, it's cozy, you know, it's welcoming. And then when you look around, you see that everything's kind of in its place. It's not hyper organized or anything like that. It's friendly and welcoming, and there's a lot of wood, and there's a nice fire, and then there's toys everywhere, and they're well constructed. So you know that whoever lives there likes children. And so if someone likes children, well, if someone doesn't like children, it's like you should run away from them very rapidly. But if they like children, well, then that's a good sign that, you know, Jesus, they're at least human. It's a start, you know. And then these things are all high quality. They're made very well. And then and he's looking around to see all of this, and there's toys, and there's clocks, and they're all handmade. And so he sort of infers that maybe there's a woodcarver who lives there, and a woodcarver is someone who can build things. And if you build things that work and that are beautiful, that's a kind of truth, right? It's like it's built right into the object. That's what quality is. Quality is the building into an object of truth. The thing works. It does what it's supposed to. It has integrity. And so you see that everywhere in here. And so you're getting a sense of the filmmakers are setting the stage. And so, well, so they set the stage by showing you the stage, and the cricket tells you what he sees, and he's pretty happy to be there because, and this is also someone who's concerned about time, right? Because there's a lot of clocks, and so time turns out to be an important sub-element of this story. And then he sees the puppet. He's a marionette. And so what's a marionette? Well, a marionette, and he's sitting on the shelf, a marionette is something that's quasi-animated, because it can move. It doesn't really have a soul, but it sort of acts like it has a soul, in the sense of anima and soul and animated. But a marionette is something that is being manipulated by something else behind the scenes, right? It doesn't have its own volition. It's dependent on the will of something behind the scenes. And so there's a strong implication that whatever this thing is half formed, and that it's being manipulated by unseen forces behind the facade. Well, that's a Freudian idea. That's you. That's all of you. You know, you're pulled hither and fro by unconscious forces, and some of those are biological, and some of them are cultural, you know. And you think about people who were swept up in great ideological movements like the communists or the fascists. It's like those people are marionettes. That's exactly what they are. They all say the same thing. They all mouth the same words. They all act the same way, and something's behind it. And the question is what? Well, that is the question, and that's partly what this movie tries to figure out. So you see this marionette. He's a half-formed, wooden-headed puppet, and he has a little bit of potential, you know. And the cricket goes up and interacts with him and sees that he's made out of pretty good wood, and makes a little joke about having a wooden head, and you know, that's kind of obvious what that means. And you notice the cricket is dressed like a tramp, and when you first saw him, he wasn't. He was dressed like a 1920s millionaire. So but here he's a tramp, and this is so interesting. It's like, so this bug that's a messiah, that's the introduction to the book, that's the conscience, is also a tramp with no home. It's like, what does that mean? And it took me a long time to sort that out. And it's like, he's been everywhere, this tramp. He's been everywhere, and he knows, he's traveled the world, but he doesn't have a place. He doesn't have a home. He hasn't made a relationship with anything real yet. He's kind of a potential. And this is one of the things that's really interesting about this movie, because if you think about the cricket as a fragment of the hero, and say a reflection of the savior, which is his relationship with JC, of course, and the person who introduces the book, then the story gets strange, because if it was merely a representation of the perfect person, the archetype of the hero, then the conscience would know everything, right? And it would just tell the puppet what to do, and that would be the end of it. But that, first of all, that's a dull story. It's like perfect conscience comes along, puppet does everything it says, bingo, perfection. But that isn't what happens. There's this weird idea that this thing that's got all these attributes needs a home and has to enter into a learning relationship with the thing that it's trying to transform. It's so sophisticated, because you know, I could say, you should do what your conscience tells you. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe that's not exactly how it works. Maybe your conscience isn't omniscient and omnipotent. Maybe it's not God, right? It's a guide. But it's maybe smarter than you sometimes, maybe because it's society in your head. And obviously it's smarter than you sometimes because it tells you not to do something and you go do it, and then you get into trouble and you think, well, if I would have just listened, but you don't. And that's interesting too. It's something that you don't have to listen to, which seems to be associated with free will. It's weird. It's like if your conscience knows what to do, why aren't you just a deterministic puppet of your conscience? Christ, that would work a lot better. You wouldn't have to torture yourself and you wouldn't make any mistakes. So why the separation? Well, maybe it's because the conscience is generic. And so it has to be taught. It has to learn too. And so what you do is you have a dialogue with your conscience. It's something like that. And then you expose yourself to more and more of the world, and you get wiser and your conscience gets wiser, and you mature together. And that's what happens in this story, because the cricket starts out as this tramp that, you know, is smarter than the puppet, but not as smart as he thinks he is, that's for sure. And when he first starts to operate as a conscience, he's completely useless at it. He babbles off a lot of cliches about morality, and then he's late the first day for his job, and he's just not very good at it. And so there's this weird idea that the conscience, which is part of what puts you towards redemption, is something that you actually have to interact with over the course of your life in order for it to develop as you develop. And so then I would also say that the cricket represents, at least in part, what Jung described as the self, which is like the potential, fully developed human being that sort of exists within you as a possibility. But it has to be manifest in the actual conditions of your life. And so the conscience has to learn how to position itself here and now. And it's got generic advice, and that's not good enough. And so that's why the cricket is looking for a home. And so he needs a home, even though he's all these other things we already said he was. He has to find a specific home before he can become who he could be. Well, so then Geppetto shows up, and he's a kindly old guy, which is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. And you know, he's a careful craftsman, and he likes kittens, and you know, that's always a good thing. And he has some fish, and you know, he's good at making things, and he's got a sense of humor, and he's kind of playful, and so he's the good father, fundamentally. He's the wise king. He's the positive archetype of the masculine. And that's what he is. And so he's culture in its positive manifestation, and he gives rise to this creation, which is his puppet, which is what culture does, because you're a puppet of your culture. You're a marionette of your culture. And so maybe you could be more than that. And that's the other thing that's strange about this movie, and it's strange about the mythological way of looking at the world, because scientifically, deterministically, there's nature and there's culture. And you are the deterministic product of the interaction between nature and culture. There's nothing else to you than that. That's that. But the mythological world doesn't say that. It says something different. It says that there's nature and culture, and then there's you. And the you that's in there has choices and a destiny, and that you actually affect the interplay of nature and culture in determining your own character. And it insists upon that. The oldest stories we have, there's always the hero and the archetypal mother and the archetypal father. There's always those three things. There's never just two. So from the narrative perspective, there's always the implication that there's something autonomous about the hero of the story. And you know, you can't account for that. We don't have a good way of accounting for that from a scientific perspective. I was having a discussion with Sam Harris the other day, which was very, what would you say? He said we got wrapped around an axle, which is pretty much, Sam Harris is one of the four famous, you know, atheists, along with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, yeah. And so we were having a discussion, and he's a determinist, just right down to the bottom. It's like you're determined, there's no free will. You're a deterministic machine. And you know, if you're a coherent scientist and you're a Newtonian, roughly speaking, you don't really have much choice other than to think that way. But that isn't how it seems to people. And we don't treat each other that way. And our entire legal system is predicated on the idea that you do in fact have free will. So, well, can we account for it? Well, no. And do we have a scientific model for it? No. But then I would also say we do not have a scientific model for consciousness. We don't know a damn thing about consciousness, which is why Dan Dennett's book, which was called Consciousness Explained, was referred to by its critics as Consciousness Explained Away, which is exactly right as far as I'm concerned, because he took a mechanistic approach, and I just don't think you get to do that, because there's something really weird about consciousness. I mean, the phenomenologists like Heidegger, who tried to radically transform Western philosophy right from the bottom up, he basically said, well, you know, you can treat the world as if consciousness is primary and that human experience is reality, that's reality, and that it doesn't exist independently of consciousness in any explicable way. It's like, well, what's out there if there's nothing to experience it? Well, everything at once. It's something like that. It's not really comprehensible. As without a subject, the subject defines it and makes it real. Now, you don't have to believe that, but at least I'm telling you that there are thoroughly coherent philosophical positions that make that case very strongly, and that allow consciousness to exist as a phenomena and to take it seriously. And you certainly act like you take it seriously. You act like there's a you and that you make choices, and you certainly treat other people that way. Deterministic or not, you're still going to get angry when they're being, you know, rude to you, and you're going to act as if they had some choice in the matter. Now, maybe that's an illusion, possibly, but maybe it's not. And I would say the oldest stories that we have always include that as not only a fundamental element, but even as the fundamental element. So, well, so you can think about that however you want. But anyway, so Geppetto comes along and he's going to finish off the puppet. And so what does he do to finish off the puppet? He gives it a voice. He gives it a mouth. Well, that's really, really interesting. So in Genesis, this is a very, very, very complex idea, and it took people thousands of years to figure this idea out. And it's something like this. So at the beginning of everything, there was chaos, and that was like potential. It was something like potential, the potential for being. And God, who's God the Father in the Genesis account, uses a faculty that he has, which is the Word, to call being from chaos, and that's the creation of being, right? It's the manifestation of order from chaos, and it's the Word, the Logos, it's the Logos that's the tool that God uses to do that. And that Logos in Christianity is associated with Christ, which is a very weird thing. But the reason for that is that there's an idea that the divine element of the individual is the thing that uses language, communicative language, to call the world into being. And that is what we do. As far as we can tell, it's like you make a decision, you think it through, you talk it over with your friends, you plot a course, and the world manifests itself in relationship to your choice. And it's for that reason, and it is for that reason, that in Genesis and in many other accounts, that Logos capacity is identified with human beings. It's like you have a small bit of that in you, whatever that means, and you participate in the process of continually generating order out of chaos, and sometimes the reverse. You mediate between them. And so, and that in Western culture, and it's certainly the case in other cultures as well, that's why you have rights, fundamentally. That's why the law has to respect you, is because you've got this spark of divinity in you that's transcendent, that nobody gets to transgress against. And you say, well, do you believe that? It's like, well, you act like you believe it. You treat other people like you believe it, or they're not very happy with you. So it depends on what you mean by believe. You act it out. Well, do you accept it as a proposition? Well, I don't care if you accept it as a proposition, frankly, because I think the best indicator of what you believe is how you act, not what you say. Because what do you know about what you know? Hardly anything. And so actions speak louder than words. And if you want to be treated properly by someone, what that means is that you want them to treat you as a valuable, autonomous entity. That's what you want. And so maybe you're not that. Maybe you're a deterministic puppet. And what this strange movie suggests is that you are kind of a deterministic puppet, but that you don't have to be. All right? Well, the mouth goes on. And then Geppetto's happy about that, and then they have a little dance. You know, they turn the music on, and all these little music boxes, and they all play together, and it's like harmony of some sort has been established because that's what the music represents, and there's layers of reality that are communicating with one another because that's what the music represents, and then they have a little dance, and the idea is that, well, it's a good thing to let this puppet have its own voice. Well, that's an interesting idea, because what the hell does it know? It's a wooden-headed marionette. Why the hell would you want something like that to talk? Well, it's the same question you have in relationship to your children. It's like, what do they know? They're 2 or 3, you know, they don't know anything. Well, so should you just like tyrannize them and make them do everything you want, or are you going to let them have a bit of a voice? And the question is, it depends on whether you want them to be a puppet or not. And if you don't want them to be a puppet, if you want them to grow up autonomous, then you let them have a voice, and you facilitate the development of that voice. And so, and that's what you do if you don't want a marionette. So, and Geppetto doesn't want a marionette, so he gives the puppet a voice, even though he knows it's just a puppet, and that it doesn't know anything. And then, this is fantastic. So, the cricket's sitting up there watching that. He's pretty happy with it. That's the first little scene you see there. And he's sitting by this other thing that is just not happy at all. And that's the terrible father. And you see, it's a character that repeats throughout the entire movie. You see manifestations of the tyrannical father continually through the movie in different characters. Like he's played out by different roles. And so, first of all, the cricket is so thrilled about this, and then he looks at the frowning king there, who is not happy that the puppet has been given a voice. He's a tyrant, right? He's the representation of a tyrant, and a tyrant does not want you to have a voice. And so the cricket looks at him and says, well, you can't please everybody all the time. And it's just this tiny little fragment of a joke, you know, but there's this old idea, I think it comes from Chekhov, and the idea is that if you set a play up and there's a gun, a rifle, or a pistol on a table in the first act, it better have been used by the third act, or it shouldn't have been there at all. And the idea is, you don't put anything in your play that's random. You never do that. It's like, because this isn't life. This isn't life. This is a work of art, and everything is connected, and it's it's there by intent. And so this isn't accidental that this little king character doesn't like what's going on, or that he shows up. So anyways, all the clocks go off and the music boxes go, and they have a little dance, and everybody's happy about it. And then Geppetto notices what time it is, and so there's a tremendous emphasis on time in this part of the movie, because all these clocks are going off, and they're all telling him what time it is. Like 30 clocks go off, and then he takes his watch out and notices what time it is. It's like the idea that there's something about time going on is like whacked at you, you know, dozens of times so that you get it. And it's a little joke that he, you know, pulls out his watch and he figures out it's time for bed. Well, so now we're making a transition between the conscious world and the unconscious world. Okay, so there's an intimation in the movie that everything that happens now is in the unconscious world. And the way you know that is that it's strange, because the movie moves in and out of this underworld. But at the very end, when Pinocchio is transformed into a real boy, the last thing Geppetto does is, I think it's Geppetto, is hit one of the pendulums and start all the clocks again. So it's as if what happens from here onwards is part of a dream. Now it's murky, because Pinocchio goes to school, and you know, there's the next day and all of that, and so those are sort of realistic elements. But then there's also the whole going down into the ocean to find the whale thing, which seems completely dreamlike. But there's an intimation that we're in a different kind of world, and so they all go to sleep, including the cricket. And so then Geppetto notices the star, and because he's a good guy, he makes a wish on the star. We've already explained why you might wish on a star and what that might mean. And he makes a very interesting wish. It's not a self-serving wish. In fact, it's quite the contrary. He doesn't wish that Pinocchio is an obedient son. He doesn't wish that he's produced someone who will work for him. He doesn't wish any of that. He wishes what a good father would wish, which is that the creation that he's brought forth would develop its capacity for autonomy. He wants him to become real. He wants him to become an actual living creature and not a wooden-headed marionette. And so you'd say, well, that is what your father should wish for you, you know, and I have clients frequently whose fathers weren't like that at all. They were tyrannical, or they were neglectful, or they punished the person every time they did something good. That's a real fun game. They competed with them and undermined them at every opportunity. They didn't want to produce someone strong and autonomous. They wanted to give birth to a slave and then diminish it as much as possible. And so that's bad. It's not good. And that's, so Geppetto's not like that. So he says, well, I'm going to wish for something completely unreasonable, which is that part of that ideal idea, right? And the unreasonable thing is that this puppet could become real, could actually take on its autonomy and move forward. And so that's what he wishes. And then they go to sleep. And then the cricket starts to become driven mad by the noises of the clock. And so it's like he's going into this sort of state of hyper alertness, and the clocks are clanging at him, and Geppetto is snoring, and he can even hear the little grains of sand falling out of the hourglass. He's becoming hyper alert, and then he yells, "Stop!" and all the clocks stop, which is a pretty good trick for a cricket, you know. It's like he's the master of time, but also we're in a place now where time has come to a stop. We're outside of time. And one of the things that Freud pointed about dreams is that dreams are kind of outside of time. Now, here's what that means, is first of all, they draw on eternal themes. That's part of it. But you know, you must have had this experience, and Freud noted this carefully in the interpretation of dreams, where, you know, you're sleeping, and the alarm goes off, and the alarm noise is incorporated into your dream, and it's like the dream has been going on for an hour in subjective time, and you wake up and you realize that it's the alarm clock. It's like, and there's no reason why your dream time should be the same as real time, because it's all going on in your imagination. But it's amazing, in some sense, how much can happen in such a short period of time in your imagination. And so it's outside of time. The world of fantasy is in some sense outside of time. And so the cricket tells time to stop, and it does. And then the star enlarges, and it turns into this blue fairy who's got a celestial gown covered with stars, and who's got wings, so she's kind of some ethereal being. And like, you don't have a problem with that in the movie. It's like, yeah, sure, I mean, you know, it's a fairy, it came from a star, that makes perfect sense, which of course it does. It makes no sense whatsoever, right? It makes no sense, but you're willing to go along with it, because on the one hand it makes no sense, and on the other hand it makes perfect sense. It's like the fairy godmother idea. It's like, yeah, fairy godmother, no problem, we got that. And the idea there is that, well, nature comes to your aid. It's something like that. It's the benevolent force of nature is on your side. Now, not obviously only on your side, because it opposes you as well, and there's your own mother as well, who's also nature, who's on your side. And so, but there's an idea here, and the idea is that if the father gets the wish right, the aim right for the child, then nature will cooperate. Right, and that's true. I believe that's true, is that if you set up your relationship, your cultural relationship with your child properly, then they're far more likely to flourish. And so you get the magic of nature on your side by establishing the proper aim. And so that's what happens. Geppetto says, well, this is what I'm aiming at, and because he's aiming at it, and because it's within the realm of possibility, nature comes to his service. And that is how it works. That's exactly how it works, because when you aim at something, then you muster your biological forces towards that goal, and if the goal is feasible and attainable, then you will cooperate with yourself. And so that's quite cool. Carl Rogers would call that, what's the word for that? I think he called it genuineness, which is kind of weak. But I think that's still what he called it. He sort of meant that, well, that's sort of what happens when your goals and your physiological and your biological being are aligned well, and you can communicate both. You're not full of internal contradictions. And so your conscious aims and your biological possibilities are manifesting themselves in the same direction. And so, well, that would be good. So anyways, the fairy shows up, and she's quite sexually attractive. She's quite provocative, and she charms the cricket. and who gets all blushes and like is all, you know, embarrassed and overwhelmed by this like figure of celestial beauty, and decides to cooperate. The conscience decides to cooperate and gets some responsibility, and so the fairy allows the puppet to move without strings. So that's kind of interesting. So it's the intervention of nature. Culture focuses the aim, then it's the intervention of nature that produces the autonomy. And that seems to be right. I mean, even though it's not that understandable, it seems to be right. And then, so she takes the strings off Pinocchio. And you might say, well, that's partly because your child is certainly not just a creature of culture. By no means. Your child has a temperament. You'll see that right away. And that temperament will unfold. And hopefully it'll unfold in a cultural context that's amenable to it. And that the combination of those two things will produce something new. He can talk. He can walk. And so the good fairy basically tells him that he's got a bit of autonomy, and now it's up to him to like clue in a bit and act properly and learn the difference between good and evil and to speak truthfully and all that. It's a bit propagandistic, that part of the movie, I would say, but it doesn't really matter. It's kind of inculcation of conventional morality, and there's a fair bit to it, especially that he's supposed to tell the truth. And you know, he says he will, and the cricket's listening, and then the puppet asks, well, what does conscience mean? Because the fairy says, always let your conscience be your guide. And he says, well, what does conscience mean? And then the bug, who's like all puffed up because he wants to impress the fairy, pops down and gets on his little matchbox and gives this like horrible little lecture about how to behave properly. That's just like ideological chatter. You can hardly even stand listening to it. And it's supposed to be like that. It's generic moral advice that anyone could give that's kind of dull and also puffed up and grandiose, and he's just not very good at it. So, and that's why he's on his little matchbox there with his chest puffed out. And so he says, that's just the trouble with the world today. And I think that's his opening line, you know, that he's diagnosing the whole world. And you know, the fairy, she thinks he's kind of funny because he is. And you know, it's sort of, there's a real interesting thing here going on, because he's male and he's all puffed up with his knowledge, which is completely shallow, and then he's put in contact with this like celestial feminine ideal, and he just turns into a complete moron. And that's exactly what happens to men. It happens to them all the time. So anyways, she decides to give him a chance and turns him into this conscience, and all of a sudden he's this like 1920s millionaire. So he's been ennobled. But then she tells him that, you know, he has to journey along with Pinocchio in order for things to go properly, and he promises that he'll be a good conscience and do it, and he already thinks that he can do it, and that's why he's on the matchbox podium, you know, espousing his morality, but the reality turns out to be much more complex. So the bug has a little talk with the cricket. The bug has a little talk with the puppet, and the bug tries to tell Pinocchio explicitly what it means to be good, and he gets completely tangled up in the explanation, because what the hell does he know? And the puppet doesn't understand anything that he says anyways. And so there's a message there, and the message is the kind of knowledge that the conscience and the puppet are supposed to co-create is not something that you can articulate easily as a table of rules. It's not like that, because life is too complicated to just have 5 rules that you live by and that will solve every problem. Partly because the rules will conflict. That's a huge part of the problem, right? One moral guideline contradicts another in a situation. It's like you don't know what to do. So anyways, they decide that they're just going to, Pinocchio says, well, I'll be a good boy, and the cricket says, well, that's the spirit. And then, well, then Geppetto gets wind of it, and they have a little like horror episode, and then he finds out that the puppet is autonomous, and they have a little party, which tells you exactly what Geppetto's up to. Is the autonomy emerges, and he's happy about it. So it's stamping home the notion that Geppetto is in fact a good guy, and that is in fact what he wants. So it's like the encouragement of your father is a precondition for the emergence of your individuality, and it also allows the feminine to play a role, both as nature and perhaps as mother. and the combination of those two things produces the autonomous individual. It's like, well, that seems perfectly reasonable. So off they go to sleep. Next day they wake up and it's a new day, and Pinocchio is off to school, and that's a good thing too, because Geppetto isn't, and he's really excited about it. And so what that means is that he's been parented properly, and he's going to go out into the world of his peers, which is where he belongs, and Geppetto isn't too worried about it. In fact, he's pushing him out the door, you know. It's like, go, you can do it, this is the next thing. The kid isn't cowering in the corner and overcome by terror, and with the parents freaking out about all the things that are going to go wrong. There's some faith in his ability. So he sees all the kids wandering by, and Geppetto dresses him up and sends him off to school. And so that's good. So that's a happy family story. It's like mom and dad got together, they decided that the kid was going to, you know, be competent and autonomous and ready to face the world, and so out he goes. And so he's like 5 years old at this point or something like that, and that's where we're at in the story. And I think that's a good place to stop, because the next thing that happens is anomaly, essentially. It's like Pinocchio goes off to be a good boy, but it turns out that that's a hell of a lot more complicated than he might think, because there are actually complications in the world, but also malevolence, right? The desire for things not to go right. There are people who are not oriented towards the ideal in any way at all. And Pinocchio's young and naive, and so he has no defense whatsoever against this malevolence, and that's, you know, that's not unexpected. And it also turns out that the conscience, the cricket, who is still not very clued in, oversleeps. And so he's just not there at a critical moment. But I think we'll pick that up next week, because this is a good point in the plot to stop. The child has entered the broader world. For father, and he had anymore. But now it's up to him. That's the thing. Now it's all right.